The wind whipped across the barren plains of Montana Territory, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and the ever-present dust that seemed to permeate every aspect of life. For Silas Blackwood, the dust was more than just an annoyance. It was a constant, gritty reminder of the empire he was building and the precarious foundation upon which it rested. His sprawling ranch, aptly named the Horizon, stretched as far as the eye could see, a testament to his ambition and his ruthlessness. But beneath the veneer of prosperity, a storm was brewing, one that Silas hadn't anticipated and certainly didn't know how to weather. He stood on the porch of his elegant yet stark homestead, gazing out at the thousands of head of cattle that dotted the landscape. Each one represented a piece of the puzzle, a number in a ledger that he meticulously manipulated. The bank loan for the expansion, the ostentatious purchase of neighboring lands, the whispers of his burgeoning influence, it all added up to a carefully constructed illusion of success. Silas was a man who understood numbers, but not the kind that could be found in a simple accounting book. He dealt in futures, in leverage, in the art of making more money appear from thin air. His accountant, a meek man named Arthur Finch, was due to arrive any day. Silas had summoned him from back east, promising a lucrative position and a chance to escape the city's suffocating embrace. Finch was supposed to be the final piece of his financial masterpiece, the man who would smooth out the rough edges, legitimize his operations, and secure his legacy. Silas envisioned Finch poring over ledgers, his brow furrowed in concentration, while Silas himself basked in the glow of his accomplishments. He envisioned a quiet life, respected and feared in equal measure, but the plains had a way of humbling even the most ambitious men. The past few months had been a relentless cycle of drought and dwindling profits. The cattle were thin, the feed was scarce, and the creditors were becoming increasingly vocal. Silas had leveraged everything, stretching his finances thinner than a worn-out saddle string. The $10 million he had so confidently projected in his latest financial statements was rapidly becoming a phantom, a ghost of profits past. He needed Finch to make the numbers work, to somehow conjure that missing sum, or at least create a plausible explanation for its absence. A lone rider approached in the distance, a speck against the vast azure sky. Silas squinted, his heart giving a nervous flutter. It wasn't Finch's usual carriage. This rider was moving with a desperate urgency, kicking up a plume of dust that seemed to mirror Silas's own internal turmoil. As the rider drew closer, Silas saw it was a young woman, her clothes ragged and her face smudged with dirt. There was a lean hunger in her eyes that spoke of hardship far beyond what Silas usually encountered in his comfortable world. She reined in her horse, a bony, weary creature, just a few yards from the porch. "Mr. Blackwood." "Chum," her voice was raspy yet surprisingly clear. I was told you might be in need of someone to read numbers." Silas eyed her with suspicion. A woman? Out here? Asking about numbers? It was unheard of. Women in Montana Territory were meant for tending hearths and raising families, not for the complex world of finance. He scoffed inwardly. This must be some kind of cruel joke played by the harsh realities of the West. Yet there was something in her gaze, a flicker of intelligence that pricked his curiosity. "And who might you be, girl?" Silas asked, his voice a low rumble. "And how do you know about my need for someone to read numbers?" The girl's shoulders sagged slightly, but she held his gaze. "My name is Clara. I haven't eaten in 2 days. I heard you were looking for an accountant. I may not have books or fancy clothes, but I can read numbers like no one you've ever met." She gestured vaguely towards the vast expanse of his ranch. "I can see the patterns, Mr. Blackwood. I can see what's there and what's not." Silas leaned against the porch railing, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face. This was unexpected, perhaps even useful. He needed a miracle, and perhaps this starving girl, with her wild claims, was just the sort of unexpected player he could manipulate. He saw not a savior, but a pawn, a desperate pawn. "Is that so?" he drawled, his eyes never leaving her. "And what makes you so confident, Clara? Numbers, you say? Tell me, what do you see when you look at my ranch?" Clara scanned the horizon, her eyes moving with a speed that belied her exhaustion. "I see potential," she said, her voice gaining a touch of conviction. "But I also see discrepancies, a lot of them." Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Discrepancies. This girl, barely more than a child, was already seeing the cracks in his facade. He decided to play along, to test her mettle. He had a feeling this encounter was going to be far more interesting and potentially more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The dust swirled around them, a silent witness to the beginning of a game Silas was about to lose, without even realizing he was playing. Silas invited Clara into the homestead, not out of any sense of hospitality, but out of a potent blend of curiosity and a nascent desire to control the narrative. The interior of the Horizon's main house was a study in contrasts. Richly furnished with imported mahogany and plush carpets, yet eerily silent and impersonal. It spoke of wealth, but not of warmth. Clara's ragged boots scuffed against the polished floor, a stark intrusion into Silas's curated world. He watched her closely, noting the way her eyes darted around, taking in every detail, but always returning to the scattered papers and ledgers on his grand desk. "So you claim to be good with numbers," Silas said, gesturing for her to sit on a stiff-backed chair opposite him. He poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, the amber liquid glinting in the afternoon sun filtering through the tall windows. He offered none to Clara, who sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the papers. "Arthur Finch, my accountant, is due any day. He's a man of considerable talent from back east." Clara's lips twitched almost imperceptibly. "Talent is one thing, Mr. Blackwood. Honesty is another. And seeing the truth is something else entirely." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Honesty? Truth? Those are luxuries, girl. Out here, survival is the only currency that matters." He picked up a ledger, its leather cover worn from frequent use. "Tell me, what do you see here?" He slid the ledger across the desk. Clara's slender fingers, stained with dirt and chapped from the elements, hovered over the pages before she dared to touch them. Her eyes scanned the rows of figures, her brow furrowing in concentration. Silas watched her, a predatory glint in his eyes. He wanted to see her falter, to see her admit that this was beyond her grasp. This is your cattle inventory," she said slowly, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. "But the numbers, they don't quite add up. There are too many discrepancies between the reported herds and the actual numbers I glimpsed on the plains, and the feed costs. They seem inflated significantly." Silas's hand tightened around his whiskey glass. This was more than just a lucky guess. This girl was actually looking, seeing. "Inflated! How dare you accuse me of such a thing? Those are the costs of keeping my business afloat. But they don't reflect the reality of what you're buying," Clara countered, her voice steady. "For instance, this entry here," she pointed a trembling finger at a line item, "for premium hay, 500 bales. I passed a hay farmer's wagon just yesterday on the road outside of town. He had no record of selling you anything close to that amount, and the price listed per bale, it's almost double what he told me he was selling it for." Silas felt a prickle of unease. He had been using Finch's upcoming arrival as a shield, but this girl was an unexpected threat. He had fabricated these numbers, inflated expenses to mask the dwindling profits, to create the illusion of a thriving enterprise. He had relied on Finch's discretion, his willingness to overlook minor adjustments in exchange for a generous salary. But this girl, she was a wild card. "You speak with a lot of authority for someone who claims to be starving," Silas said, trying to regain control. "Perhaps you've mistaken your hunger for insight." Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time Silas saw not just desperation, but a fierce, unyielding intelligence. "Hunger sharpens the senses, Mr. Blackwood. When you have nothing, You learn to notice everything, especially when numbers represent the difference between life and death. She paused, then looked back at the ledger. And there's more. The loan interest, it's being calculated on a much larger sum than the actual amount borrowed. It's a clever trick to make your debt seem more manageable, but it's also a lie. Silas felt a cold dread creep into his stomach. This was exactly what he had feared. Finch had been instructed to manipulate the books, but Clara, this penniless waif, was dissecting his carefully constructed lies with an alarming ease. He had wanted an accountant to fix the numbers, not to expose them. He had been waiting for Finch, but he had found Clara instead. And Clara, with her starving eyes and her unnerving grasp of arithmetic, was a far greater danger than any creditor. The silence in the room grew heavy, punctuated only by the distant cry of a hawk and the frantic beating of Silas's own heart. He had a $10 million problem, and the solution, it seemed, was a starving girl who could read numbers. Silas dismissed Clara with a curt nod, his mind a chaotic whirl of suspicion and calculation. He had underestimated her, grievously. He had seen a desperate face, a plea for sustenance, and had offered a pittance in exchange for a brief diversion. Now he saw a sharp mind, an inconveniently honest gaze, and a potential threat to his entire empire. He had been waiting for Arthur Finch, his trusted, if complicit accountant, to arrive and help him paper over the mounting cracks in his financial facade. Instead, he had found Clara, a girl whose unbidden observations had pierced through his carefully crafted illusion like a bullet through tissue. He paced his study, the scent of aged whiskey and expensive cigar smoke doing little to calm his frayed nerves. Clara had seen the inflated feed costs, the discrepancies in the cattle inventory, and most damningly, the subtle manipulation of his loan interest. These weren't minor errors, they were the very pillars of his fraud. The $10 million he had projected was built on these very calculations, a house of cards teetering on the brink of collapse. He needed Finch to continue the charade, not to have it dissected by a starving orphan. He decided to employ Clara, but on his terms. He wouldn't give her access to the core of his deceit, not yet. He needed to understand her, to gauge the depth of her knowledge, and more importantly, her potential for loyalty, or, failing that, her susceptibility to control. He sent his foreman, a gruff man named Jed, to find her. Jed returned an hour later, his expression a mixture of bewilderment and mild disdain. "Found her down by the livery stable, boss," Jed reported, spitting tobacco juice onto the polished floor. "Looked like she was about to chew on the straw bedding. Gave her some bread and jerky. She ate it like a wolf." Silas nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in. Hunger, he knew, was a powerful motivator. "Tell her I have work for her. Simple work. Helping me sort through some old documents, and tell her she'll be fed and given a place to sleep, a roof over her head at least." Clara returned, her eyes brighter, her hunger momentarily appeased, but her gaze still sharp. Silas led her to a small, dusty room off the main hall, filled with overflowing boxes and scattered papers. "These are old tax records, correspondence from years past," he explained, his voice deliberately casual. "Just organize them, file them, make sense of the chaos." He watched her as she began her task. She worked with an unhurried diligence, her small hands carefully sifting through brittle pages. She didn't complain about the dust or the disarray. She simply worked, her focus absolute. Silas couldn't resist testing her again. "You said you saw discrepancies in my cattle numbers, Clara," he began, leaning against the doorframe. "That's quite an observation, considering you've only been here a few hours." Clara looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "I didn't see your ledgers, Mr. Blackwood. I saw your herds from the road, and I saw the hay farmer's wagon. I've spent my life watching, counting, noticing. When you have nothing, you learn to make every observation count." She gestured to a stack of papers. "These old accounts, they show a pattern of growth, consistent, steady, but the numbers you've been presenting lately, they're too aggressive. They suggest a leap that doesn't align with the evidence I saw, even from a distance." Silas felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. She wasn't just good with numbers. She had an intuitive understanding of business and finance that belied her age and experience. He had intended to keep her busy with trivial tasks, to lull her into a false sense of security, but she was already seeing through his diversions. "The world changes, Clara," Silas said, his voice hardening. "Businesses grow, fortunes are made, or they are fabricated," Clara replied softly, her gaze returning to the documents. "These old ledgers, they tell a different story, Mr. Blackwood. A story of hard work, yes, but also of careful omissions. And these newer ones," she tapped a fresh ledger on the desk, "they seem to be trying to cover those omissions with even bigger numbers. It's like trying to hide a stain with a bigger ink spill." Silas felt a surge of anger, quickly suppressed. This girl was a threat, a dangerous one. He had been waiting for Finch to arrive and affirm his fabricated reality. Instead, he had found Clara, a starving girl who could see the tarnish on his ledger with unsettling clarity. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that Arthur Finch's arrival was no longer a solution. It was the beginning of a new, far more complex problem. He had a $10 million fraud to conceal, and the only person who could see through it was a waif who had walked in from the dust looking for a meal. Arthur Finch arrived 2 days later, a small, meticulous man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, and a briefcase that seemed to contain the sum total of his worldly possessions. He was precisely the sort of accountant Silas had envisioned, quiet, unassuming, and eager to please. Finch was a creature of habit and order, his life a meticulously organized series of ledgers and balance sheets. He was the antithesis of Clara, who moved through the world with a raw, unpolished instinct. Silas greeted Finch with a practiced smile, his anxiety a low thrum beneath the surface. He ushered the accountant into his study, the same room where he had first encountered Clara. The air still held the faint scent of her presence, a subtle reminder of the unexpected complication that had arisen. "Welcome, Arthur," Silas said, clapping Finch on the shoulder. "I trust your journey was uneventful." "Perfectly so, Mr. Blackwood," Finch replied, his voice soft and precise. "The roads were clear, the stagecoach prompt. I've brought all my instruments as requested." He patted his briefcase. "Ready to bring order to your financial affairs." Silas poured them both a drink, his eyes never quite meeting Finch's. "Excellent. I've been looking forward to your arrival. There are certain adjustments that need to be made, some creative accounting, perhaps, to ensure the bank remains satisfied." Finch nodded, unperturbed. He had encountered such requests before. Silas was a client, and Finch's role was to fulfill his client's needs within certain acceptable parameters. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood. We can certainly optimize your reporting, a little window dressing, as they say." As Finch began to unpack his ledgers and calculating machines, Silas subtly steered the conversation towards Clara. "There's a young woman here, Clara, a local girl. I've given her some menial tasks sorting through old papers. She's remarkably sharp for her station, sees things others miss." Finch adjusted his spectacles, a flicker of mild curiosity in his eyes. "Indeed. I've always found that a keen eye for detail is a valuable asset, regardless of one's background." "She's already noticed some irregularities," Silas admitted, choosing his words carefully. "Inconsistencies in the cattle counts, inflated feed costs. Minor things, of course, that you'll easily be able to explain away." Finch's brow furrowed slightly. "Minor irregularities. Mr. Blackwood, if these inconsistencies are significant, they could indeed impact our financial statements. We must be careful not to overstep." Silas's smile tightened. He hadn't expected Finch to be so principled, or perhaps it was just a performance. Silas had always assumed Finch was fully aware of the extent of his manipulations and complicit. Now, he wasn't so sure. "Finch, my boy," Silas said, his voice taking on a more authoritative tone. "My business is built on appearances. I need those appearances to be impeccable. The bank requires a certain projection of success." What Clara saw were merely phantom numbers, shadows on the ledger. "You will explain them away, naturally. Ensure they do not cause undue concern." He watched Finch closely. The accountant's hands were steady as he laid out his tools, but his lips were pressed into a thin line. Silas saw a flicker of something in Finch's eyes. Doubt, or was it the glint of calculation? Finch was a man who understood risk, and Silas was asking him to take on a considerable amount of it. "I will do my best, Mr. Blackwood," Finch said, his voice still quiet, but with an undertone of something Silas couldn't quite decipher. "However, my reputation is built on accuracy. Fabricating numbers, that is a dangerous path." Silas chuckled, a hollow sound. "Danger is my business, Arthur. Yours is to make the numbers sing, and right now they need to sing a song of prosperity." He left Finch to his work, a gnawing sense of unease settling over him. He had summoned Finch to solve his problem, but the arrival of the accountant had only amplified his worries. Clara, with her untrained eye, had seen the truth, and Finch, the man who was supposed to obscure it, was showing signs of resistance. Silas had $10 million to account for, and he suddenly felt like he was caught between two forces, both of them threatening to expose the rot at the heart of the horizon. The shadow of Finch, the man he thought he could control, had fallen over his carefully constructed lies, and he wondered if Clara's unnerving vision was about to become his undoing. Clara continued her work in the dusty storeroom, oblivious to the subtle shift in Silas Blackwood's demeanor. She had been given the task of organizing old financial records, a seemingly innocuous job that allowed her ample opportunity to observe the inner workings of the horizon, albeit from a distance. She hadn't sought out Silas's attention. Hunger had driven her to his doorstep, and a simple desire for purpose had kept her there. But the more she sorted, the more she saw. The old ledgers, dating back nearly a decade, painted a picture of a rancher who had built his fortune through diligence and shrewd investments. There were meticulous records of cattle sales, land acquisitions, and carefully managed expenses. It was a story of a man who understood the land and its potential. But then, the new ledgers, the ones Silas had been working with before Finch's arrival, told a different story. The numbers became more aggressive, the profits more improbable, and the expenses, well, they seemed to swell with an unnatural elasticity. Silas had asked her to organize the old papers, a request that seemed designed to keep her occupied and out of the way. But in doing so, he had inadvertently provided her with the very evidence she needed to understand the present. She saw the stark contrast between the meticulous, honest accounting of the past and the increasingly speculative, often nonsensical figures of recent years. She recognized the telltale signs of manipulation, expenses that seemed too high, revenue streams that appeared to materialize from thin air, and loan interest calculated on phantom sums. One afternoon, while sifting through a particularly dusty box, Clara unearthed a sheaf of letters. They were correspondence between Silas Blackwood and a representative from the First National Bank of Helena. The tone of the early letters was cautiously optimistic, detailing loans for expansion and promising steady returns. But as the dates progressed, the tone shifted. The bank's representative began to express concern, requesting more detailed explanations for the fluctuating profits, questioning the inflated operating costs. Silas's replies, in contrast, became increasingly evasive, laced with veiled threats and pronouncements of his own infallibility. Clara read them with a growing sense of dread. She wasn't just seeing numbers anymore. She was seeing a narrative of deceit. Silas Blackwood was not the successful rancher he presented himself to be. He was a man trapped in a web of his own making, a web woven from lies and desperate financial maneuvers. The $10 million he had so confidently projected was a mirage, a phantom sum conjured to appease the bank and maintain the illusion of prosperity. She overheard snippets of conversation between Silas and Arthur Finch. Finch, the meticulous accountant, seemed increasingly uneasy. His precise language, usually a balm of order, was now laced with hesitant questions and veiled warnings about accountability and regulatory scrutiny. Silas, on the other hand, grew more impatient, his voice hardening, his demands becoming more insistent. He needed Finch to validate his lies, to present his fabricated reality as the truth. Clara knew she was in a dangerous position. She was a nobody, a starving girl who had stumbled upon a powerful man's secret. But she also knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Silas Blackwood's empire was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. She had seen the hunger in her own belly, the desperation of having nothing. She understood, perhaps better than Silas ever would, the weight of true scarcity. And she saw that Silas's projected wealth was a hollow boast, a dangerous illusion that could, and likely would, crumble around him. She was a girl who had learned to read numbers, and in Silas Blackwood's ledgers she was reading a story of impending ruin. She saw too much, and the realization filled her with a quiet terror. The arrival of Arthur Finch had injected a new layer of tension into the already fraught atmosphere of the horizon. Silas, accustomed to dictating terms and expecting blind obedience, found himself navigating a landscape of cautious professionalism and subtle resistance. Finch, while outwardly compliant, was a man of integrity, and Silas's demands to adjust the books were met with increasingly pointed questions and requests for further documentation. "Mr. Blackwood," Finch had said, his voice barely above a whisper after a particularly grueling session with the ledgers, "the figures for the Livestock Improvement Fund simply don't reconcile with the reported herd sizes. There's a deficit of nearly $150,000 that I cannot account for through standard operational expenses or sales." Silas had forced a smile, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrest of his chair. "That fund, Arthur, is for future investments, strategic acquisitions. It's a fluid allocation, not to be scrutinized too closely at this juncture." Finch had adjusted his spectacles, his gaze unwavering. "But future investments require a tangible basis, Mr. Blackwood. Without clear documentation, this looks less like strategic planning and more like a deliberate obfuscation." Silas had dismissed him curtly, but Finch's words had resonated. Obfuscation. That was precisely what Silas was engaged in. He had been so adept at juggling numbers, at creating the illusion of wealth, that he had almost convinced himself it was real. He had leveraged every asset, borrowed against future harvests, and manipulated every accounting entry to project a $10 million fortune. But Finch's methodical approach was like a relentless probing of his carefully constructed facade, each question a hammer blow against the fragile structure. Meanwhile, Clara continued her work, her understanding of Silas's deceit deepening with every document she processed. She saw the frantic efforts to cover past discrepancies, the increasingly audacious fabrications. She noticed how Silas's demeanor changed when Finch was present, a forced joviality, a constant vigilance, a subtle tightening of his jaw. He was walking a tightrope, desperate to maintain his balance. One evening, Clara found a discarded draft of a letter from Silas to the bank. It was full of bravado, promising an imminent surge in profits, referencing unseen investments that would solidify his empire. But tucked away in a corner, almost an afterthought, was a sentence that chilled her. "Should any unforeseen complications arise, rest assured that my assets are substantial enough to weather any storm, real or imagined." Real or imagined. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Silas was not just exaggerating, he was actively creating a fiction. Clara felt a growing sense of responsibility. She was a witness, an accidental auditor of a $10 million fraud. Her own survival had depended on understanding numbers, on making them work for her. Now, these numbers represented a dangerous deception that could ruin not only Silas, but potentially countless others who might be indirectly affected. She saw the strain on Silas's face, the sleepless nights etched into his features. She saw Finch's growing apprehension, the conflict between his professional ethics and his client's demands. The weight of these numbers, these fabricated millions, was crushing them all. Clara, the girl who had arrived starving and desperate, was now privy to a secret that could bring down a powerful man. She had to decide what to do with this knowledge. The truth, she realized, was a heavy burden, especially when it was disguised as wealth. Silas Blackwood paced his study like a caged lion, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Arthur Finch sat at the desk, his face pale, his fingers hovering over a fresh sheet of paper, as if afraid to commit a single numeral. The recent audits had unearthed a chasm in Silas's finances, a deficit far larger than he had ever intended to expose. The $10 million projection was rapidly becoming a cruel joke, a phantom limb of wealth that was beginning to ache with the phantom pains of reality. The Livestock Improvement Fund deficit is now estimated at nearly $300,000, Mr. Blackwood, Finch stated, his voice strained. And the discrepancy in the recorded grain purchases for the past 2 quarters suggests we've been paying for shipments that never arrived. I cannot in good conscience present these figures to the bank without further explanation. Silas slammed his fist on the desk, making Finch jump. Explanation? What explanation do you need, Finch? I told you those are strategic allocations, investments, and the grain. There were unforeseen logistical issues, delivery delays. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his usual veneer of control cracking. Logistical issues that amount to nearly a quarter of our entire winter feed supply? Finch countered, his professionalism battling with his growing alarm. Mr. Blackwood, this isn't a matter of window dressing anymore. This is outright fraud. The bank will not be placated with vague assurances. Silas's eyes narrowed. Finch was becoming a liability. He'd hired Finch to smooth over his deceptions, not to question them with such vehemence. He had brought him from the East to be a silent partner in his charade, but Finch's integrity, or perhaps his fear, was proving an unexpected obstacle. Meanwhile, Clara, in her quiet way, continued to piece together the puzzle. While organizing the older, more legitimate records, she had stumbled upon Silas's original land deeds and initial cattle purchase manifests. These documents, meticulously kept, provided a stark contrast to the current, inflated figures. She cross-referenced these with her observations from the plains. She had a remarkable ability to estimate herd sizes, a skill honed by years of observing wildlife and livestock from afar. She remembered seeing Silas's foreman, Jed, moving a small herd of cattle towards a remote, seldom-used pasture a few weeks ago. It was a maneuver Silas hadn't accounted for in any of his official reports. She also recalled Jed's hushed conversation with another ranch hand about moving the strays before Finch arrived. Strays? Or simply cattle that didn't exist on paper? Clara discreetly made her way to the remote pasture. The land was rough, sparsely vegetated and largely overlooked, and there, grazing listlessly, were a few hundred head of cattle, bony, gaunt, and clearly underfed. They were the unseen herd, the phantom livestock that inflated Silas's assets but contributed nothing to his actual profitability. They were the physical manifestation of his $10 million dream, a desperate attempt to make his numbers appear more robust. She returned to the homestead, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination. She had seen the numbers in Finch's ledger, and now she had seen the numbers on the plains, the cattle that were supposed to be there but weren't, and the cattle that were there but shouldn't be. The two realities were a gaping chasm. She found Silas in his study, his face a mask of barely suppressed fury as he argued with Finch. "You will sign these reports, Finch. My reputation depends on it." Finch stood firm, his small frame radiating an unexpected resolve. "I cannot, Mr. Blackwood. The risk is too great. If this comes to light, we will both face ruin." Clara's presence in the doorway went unnoticed for a moment. Then Silas's sharp eyes fell upon her. He saw the knowledge in her gaze, the silent indictment. He had brought Finch in to manage the crisis, but now Clara, the starving girl who read numbers, was the one who truly understood its depth. He had $10 million to account for, and the unseen herd, along with Clara's sharp eyes, were about to expose the hollow core of his ambition. Arthur Finch stared at the figures laid out before him, his usually placid demeanor replaced by a profound unease. Silas Blackwood's financial records were a labyrinth of fabricated profits, inflated expenses, and meticulously concealed debts. The $10 million Silas boasted of was a carefully constructed illusion, a house of cards built on a foundation of deceit. Finch, a man who lived by the precision of numbers, found himself in a moral and professional quandary of the highest order. "Mr. Blackwood," Finch began, his voice trembling slightly, "I cannot, in good conscience, sign off on these reports. The discrepancies are too significant. The Livestock Improvement Fund alone shows a deficit of nearly $300,000. And the grain purchases, they do not align with any verifiable deliveries. I suspect you have been deliberately misrepresenting your assets and liabilities." Silas's face contorted with rage. "Misrepresenting? I am managing my assets, Finch. I'm projecting success. The bank requires it, and the grain, there were unforeseen circumstances, things you wouldn't understand." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You are here to facilitate my business, Finch, not to scrutinize it like a common sheriff." Finch adjusted his spectacles, his resolve hardening. He had a reputation to protect, a career built on a bedrock of honesty. He had always operated within the bounds of accepted accounting practices, perhaps bending them slightly to accommodate the whims of his clients, but never outright fabricating data. "Mr. Blackwood, I am an accountant, not a confederate. What you are asking me to do is illegal. It constitutes fraud. If these falsified reports are submitted and they are discovered, the consequences for both of us will be severe." Silas scoffed, a harsh, guttural sound. "Consequences? My consequences will be a thriving empire. Yours, if you refuse, will be to find yourself back in the dust, with no one to vouch for your services." He gestured dismissively towards the door. "Now, sign the reports, Finch, or find yourself on the next stagecoach out of Montana with a rather unpleasant note attached to your name." Finch's heart sank. He was trapped. Silas had him over a barrel. He had come to the horizon expecting a lucrative, if slightly demanding, engagement. He hadn't anticipated being asked to become an accessory to a $10 million fraud. He thought of his family back east, his reputation, his future. He looked up and saw Clara standing in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She had been quietly organizing papers in an adjacent room, her presence unobtrusive until now. Silas's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Had she heard? "What do you want, girl?" Silas barked, his temper flaring. Clara held his gaze, her voice steady despite the tension. I found some old land deeds, Mr. Blackwood, and invoices for the initial purchase of cattle. They paint a very different picture than the one you're presenting now." Silas's face went ashen. He understood immediately that Clara, with her uncanny ability to decipher numbers, had uncovered the bedrock of his deceit, the original, honest figures. She was the ultimate threat, not because she had malicious intent, but because she possessed the simple, unvarnished truth. Finch, witnessing this exchange, saw a flicker of an opportunity. Clara, the unassuming observer, held the key to exposing Silas's fraud. He looked from Silas's furious face to Clara's quiet determination. He was being forced to choose between his career and his conscience, and now this young woman, this unexpected witness, had unwittingly entered the fray. "Mr. Blackwood," Finch said, his voice now firm, imbued with a newfound resolve, "I cannot sign these reports, not under duress, and not with this additional information." He glanced at Clara. "It seems there are indeed discrepancies that require a full and honest accounting." Silas Blackwood stood between his complicit accountant and the starving girl who saw the truth. The $10 million he had built his empire on was about to be exposed, not by a seasoned investigator, but by the very numbers he had tried so desperately to manipulate. The confrontation in Silas Blackwood's study crackled with an electric tension. Arthur Finch, the meticulous accountant, had finally drawn a line in the sand, refusing to sign the falsified financial reports. Silas, his fury barely contained, stood poised to retaliate, his control slipping with every passing second. And then there was Clara, the starving girl who had inadvertently stumbled upon the rotten core of Silas's empire, her quiet presence now a formidable force. Silas turned his venomous gaze on Clara. "You little fool," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You have no idea what you've done. You think you understand, but you don't. This is how the world works. It's about power, about making things appear real." Clara met his glare, her young face etched with a determination that belied her years. "I understand that numbers should reflect reality, Mr. Blackwood, not create a fantasy. And I saw your reality on the plains, the empty pastures, the thin cattle, the herd you moved to the far pasture, the one that doesn't exist on any ledger." Finch, emboldened by Clara's direct accusation, stepped forward. "She's right, Silas. I've been trying to tell you, these figures are unsustainable. The bank will uncover this. It's only a matter of time." Silas let out a bitter laugh. "Time? I have time. I have money, and I have you, Finch, whether you like it or not. You'll sign those reports, or I'll ensure you never work in this territory again." He then turned his chilling gaze back to Clara. "And you, girl, you will disappear, quietly." But Silas underestimated the unseen forces at play in the West. As Silas made his threats, a group of men, led by the local sheriff, Sheriff Brody, entered the study. Brody was a man of quiet authority, his reputation built on fairness and a keen sense of justice. He had received an anonymous tip, a detailed account of financial irregularities at the horizon, specifically mentioning inflated cattle numbers and suspicious grain purchases. The tip had come from a concerned citizen who had overheard hushed conversations and noticed unusual movements of livestock. Sheriff Brody's eyes swept over the scene, taking in Silas's furious demeanor, Finch's pallor, and Clara's resolute stance. He had been watching Silas Blackwood for some time, hearing whispers of his aggressive expansion and questionable business practices. "Mr. Blackwood," Sheriff Brody said, his voice calm but firm, "we've received some disturbing information regarding your ranch's finances. I'm afraid we'll need to see your ledgers and have a word with Mr. Finch and this young lady." Silas's face drained of color. He had been so focused on controlling Finch and silencing Clara that he had failed to consider the possibility of external scrutiny. The anonymous tip, the sudden arrival of the sheriff, it was a cascade of misfortune he hadn't anticipated. Finch, seeing the sheriff, felt a surge of relief. "Sheriff," he said, stepping forward, "I can attest to the irregularities. Mr. Blackwood has been attempting to falsify his financial statements. I have the documents here, though I have not been permitted to sign them." Clara, her heart pounding, stepped forward as well. "Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and steady, "I have also observed discrepancies. I can show you where Mr. Blackwood has been moving cattle that are not accounted for on his books. It's a significant number, enough to throw off any audit." Silas Blackwood stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. His threats, his manipulations, his $10 million illusion, all were about to be laid bare. He had been so consumed by his ambition, by the sheer audacity of his fraud, that he had overlooked the fundamental truth that justice, like a persistent prairie wind, could find its way through even the most carefully sealed doors. The unseen hand of justice, guided by an anonymous tip and Clara's sharp eyes, had arrived at the horizon, ready to sift through the dust and expose the tarnished truth. The midday sun beat down relentlessly on the sprawling Blackwood ranch, each ray a hammer blow against the parched earth. Silas Blackwood, his face a mask of practiced benevolence, surveyed his domain from the porch of his grand, if somewhat ostentatious, manor. The air thrummed with the usual sounds of a working ranch, the lowing of cattle, the distant shouts of cowboys, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. But for Silas, a new dissonant note had begun to intrude upon this symphony of success: doubt. It had started subtly, a mere tremor beneath the surface of his carefully managed composure, a misplaced ledger, a hastily corrected figure in a shipping manifest, a fleeting expression of unease on Abernathy's usually placid face. Silas, a man who prided himself on his foresight and control, found himself replaying these minor incidents, each one a tiny pebble eroding the dam of his confidence. Abernathy, his loyal, long-suffering accountant, was proving to be an unexpected liability. The man was aging, his eyesight was failing, and his hand, once steady, now trembled when he signed crucial documents. Silas had begun to suspect that Abernathy's diminishing faculties might pose a greater threat than any external auditor. Meanwhile, Eliza Vance, the quiet girl who had materialized on his doorstep like a desert mirage, was becoming an increasingly perplexing presence. She moved with an almost unnerving grace, her slender frame belying a steely resolve. Her days were filled with the arduous tasks of a ranch hand, mucking stalls, mending fences, tending to the less demanding chores around the cookhouse. But it was in the stolen moments, during the stifling heat of the afternoon, or the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, that Eliza's true nature began to surface. She devoured any scrap of paper she could find, old newspapers, discarded invoices, even the rough paper wrapping of provisions. Her hunger was not just for food, but for knowledge, for understanding. She had a peculiar fascination with the numbers that littered the ranch's operations. Initially, it was a way to pass the time, a mental exercise to stave off the gnawing boredom and the ever-present pangs of hunger. She would trace the figures with a calloused finger, her brow furrowed in concentration, the abstract symbols slowly beginning to resolve into patterns, then into meaning. The ink smudges, the hasty scribbles, the seemingly innocuous entries, they were all threads in a tapestry, and Eliza, with her nascent gift, was beginning to see the image woven within. One sweltering afternoon, while helping the cook Martha clear away the remains of a hearty midday meal, Eliza noticed a stack of invoices haphazardly piled near Abernathy's small, cluttered office. Martha, a woman whose gruff exterior hid a heart as warm as her oven, had a habit of leaving things where they fell. Eliza, her mind always drawn to the allure of figures, casually picked up a few, intending to discreetly examine them later. As she sorted through them in the privacy of her meager bunk, a strange feeling began to prickle at her. These weren't just receipts for feed and supplies. Some of them bore the distinct markings of legitimate ranch expenses, but others seemed to inflate quantities, to list deliveries that never arrived, to attribute costs to phantom services. A cold knot of unease began to form in her stomach, a sensation that had nothing to do with hunger. These weren't just mistakes, they felt deliberate. The numbers, so clear and precise on the page, were beginning to tell a story that was far from straightforward. Silas, blissfully unaware of the quiet storm brewing in his own backyard, continued his charade. He would often engage Eliza in brief, patronizing conversations, ostensibly to check on her well-being, but in reality to gauge her intelligence, to ensure she remained an unassuming fixture. He saw her as a child, A stray animal he had taken in, useful for labor, but entirely without consequence. He couldn't fathom that this starving girl, with her dust-caked hands and silent demeanor, possessed a mind that could unravel the very foundations of his empire. The whispers of doubt in Silas's mind were growing louder, but the real threat was not in his aging accountant, but in the observant eyes of the girl who read numbers. The weight of Silas Blackwood's deception pressed down on Elias Abernathy like a physical shroud. Each day was a tightrope walk, a performance of complicity that chipped away at his soul. He had served Blackwood faithfully for over a decade, initially drawn by the promise of a secure future and the allure of managing the finances of a seemingly burgeoning enterprise. But over time, the subtle requests, the veiled suggestions, the outright demands for falsified documents had escalated, transforming his role from that of an accountant to that of an enabler. Abernathy was not a malicious man. He was a creature of habit, a man who valued order and predictability. The moral ambiguity of his position gnawed at him, but the fear of Silas's retribution, coupled with a desperate need to maintain his livelihood, kept him trapped. He was a broken man, his spirit eroded by years of quiet complicity. His trembling hands, once a source of embarrassment, were now a physical manifestation of his internal turmoil. He saw the growing suspicion in Silas's eyes, the subtle tests, the increasing pressure. Silas was no fool. He knew Abernathy was aging, his memory faltering, his grip on the details loosening. And that, Silas believed, made him more pliable, more easily controlled. Eliza's presence on the ranch, however, was an unintended complication. Abernathy had noticed her, of course. She was an anomaly, a quiet, observant presence that didn't fit the typical mold of ranch hands. He'd seen her poring over scraps of paper, her brow furrowed in concentration, and a flicker of unease had ignited within him. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Eliza possessed a sharp intellect. He had even caught her once, her eyes following the intricate lines of a complex financial statement he had inadvertently left on his desk. He had quickly snatched it away, his heart pounding, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. He began to see her not as a threat, but as a potential harbinger of his own undoing. If anyone were to uncover Silas's fraudulent activities, it would likely be this quiet girl with the unusually perceptive gaze. He started to subtly steer her away from his office, offering her more demanding tasks in the far reaches of the ranch, hoping to keep her occupied and her curiosity at bay. He even, in a moment of conflicted kindness, slipped her a few extra rations, a silent apology for the potential storm she might soon find herself in. One evening, as Abernathy sat alone in his small office, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, he found himself staring at a particularly incriminating ledger. It detailed a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts, a labyrinth of financial chicanery designed to siphon millions from the investors. The ink seemed to mock him, a testament to his own moral bankruptcy. He picked up his pen, his hand shaking uncontrollably, and began to erase a fabricated entry, his breath catching in his throat. He knew he couldn't go on like this. The fear had become a constant companion, a suffocating presence that left him with no peace. Suddenly, a soft knock echoed through the quiet of the night. Abernathy jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He quickly shoved the ledger under a pile of seemingly innocuous papers. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice a hoarse whisper. "It's Eliza, Mr. Abernathy," came the soft reply. "Martha sent me with some fresh bread. You looked like you needed something warm." Abernathy hesitated for a moment, his mind racing. He knew he should refuse, should send her away. But the sight of the ledger, the weight of his secrets, the loneliness of his predicament, it all coalesced into a desperate impulse. He opened the door, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. Eliza stood there, a small basket clutched in her hands, her eyes filled with a quiet concern that belied her youth. "Thank you, child," Abernathy rasped, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in for a moment. It's cold out tonight." As Eliza stepped into the office, her eyes, sharp and observant, took in the cluttered desk, the scattered papers, and the palpable tension that hung in the air. She saw the ledger peeking out from beneath the other documents, its stark, formal headings, a stark contrast to the rough handwritten invoices she had seen scattered around the ranch. A subtle curiosity, a nascent suspicion, flickered within her. She had no idea what she was looking at, but she sensed with an unnerving clarity that this was a part of the ranch's workings that was meant to remain hidden. Abernathy's secret burden had just found an unlikely confidant, and the seeds of revelation were being sown in the most unexpected of places. Eliza accepted the warm bread from Martha with a grateful nod, her stomach rumbling in anticipation. But her mind was already elsewhere, replaying the fleeting glimpse she'd had of the ledger in Abernathy's office. The encounter, brief as it was, had ignited a spark of intense curiosity. Abernathy's visible distress, his furtive movements, and the glimpse of those imposing financial statements had all coalesced into a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. Later that evening, after the other ranch hands had retired to their bunks, Eliza found herself drawn back to the vicinity of Abernathy's office. The lamp inside had long since been extinguished, and the only light was the faint glow of the moon filtering through the dusty window pane. She approached cautiously, her movements silent on the packed earth. The door, she noted with a quickening pulse, was slightly ajar. Hesitantly, she pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, ink, and a faint, lingering scent of pipe tobacco. Her eyes, accustomed to the dim light, quickly scanned the room. Abernathy's desk was a chaotic landscape of documents, quills and inkwells. The ledger she had seen earlier was still partially exposed. With a deep breath, Eliza reached for it, her fingers brushing against the worn leather cover. She pulled it out, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She carried it to the small, rickety table by the window, where the moonlight offered just enough illumination to decipher the dense text. The entries were meticulously recorded, a testament to Abernathy's former diligence. But as Eliza began to trace the lines, her innate understanding of numbers began to work its magic. She saw the dates, the amounts, the brief cryptic descriptions. She noticed recurring account names, the same vast sums appearing again and again, attributed to transactions that seemed to defy logic. There were shipments listed that never arrived, purchases for non-existent livestock, and vast sums paid out to companies she had never heard of. Companies with names that seemed deliberately obscure, designed to hide rather than to represent. Her mind, sharp and analytical, started to connect the dots. She recalled overhearing hushed conversations among the cowboys about discrepancies in payroll, about shortages that were explained away as clerical errors. She remembered Abernathy's increasingly agitated demeanor, the way he would dismiss any inquiries with a wave of his trembling hand. Then she found it, a section of the ledger that seemed to detail transactions with a separate entity, one that bore the name Blackwood Holdings. The amounts associated with this entity were staggering, vastly exceeding the ranch's legitimate operating expenses. Furthermore, the dates of these transactions often coincided with periods of reported investor shortfalls or unexpected losses for the ranch. Eliza meticulously began to copy down the key figures, the dates, the account names, and the specific entries that seemed most out of place. She used a stolen stub of a pencil and a few precious sheets of scavenged paper, her movements precise and economical. She understood, with a dawning sense of dread and determination, that she was looking at evidence of a systematic and large-scale fraud. Silas Blackwood, the benevolent owner, was not just a rancher, he was a thief. As she worked, the enormity of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't just a few inflated bills, this was millions of dollars. Millions that belonged to investors, to families, to people who had trusted Silas Blackwood with their hard-earned money. And Abernathy, the man whose trembling hands she had witnessed, was complicit. He was trapped, just as she had been, but his trap was forged from his own actions. Suddenly a floorboard creaked outside the office. Eliza froze, her blood turning to ice. She quickly shoved the ledger back into its hiding place, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She extinguished the faint moonlight that had been illuminating her work and pressed herself against the shadowed wall, barely daring to breathe. The sound of footsteps grew closer, then paused just outside the door. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself for discovery, for the inevitable confrontation that would shatter the fragile peace of the ranch and her own precarious existence. The footsteps outside the office faded, leaving Eliza in a state of trembling relief. She had narrowly escaped discovery, but the encounter had underscored the immense danger she was in. She had seen enough, understood enough, to know that her life on the ranch, and perhaps her life itself, hung precariously in the balance. She carefully replaced the ledger, ensuring it was hidden just as she had found it, and then, with the same stealth that had allowed her to enter, she slipped back out into the night. Back in the relative safety of her small bunk, Eliza spread out the papers she had meticulously copied. The numbers swam before her eyes, a dizzying array of figures that confirmed her worst suspicions. Silas Blackwood was orchestrating a massive fraud, systematically defrauding his investors. The sheer scale of it was breathtaking, and the implications were terrifying. She was a nobody, a starving orphan girl with nothing but her wits and a handful of incriminating numbers. She knew she couldn't confront Silas directly. He was a powerful man, ruthless and accustomed to getting his way. Going to the authorities, if she could even find them and convince them to listen, seemed like a perilous gamble. She needed help, but who could she trust on this isolated ranch? Her thoughts turned to Martha, the cook. Martha was gruff and no-nonsense, but Eliza had sensed a deep well of kindness beneath her hardened exterior. Martha had often spoken of her own struggles, of being cheated and mistreated in her past. Could she be an ally? It was a risk, but Eliza felt she had no other choice. The next morning, as Eliza helped Martha with the breakfast preparations, she decided to broach the subject, treading carefully. "Martha," she began, her voice quiet, I've been seeing some strange things around here. In the ledgers." Martha paused, her spatula poised over a sizzling pan. Her eyes sharp and assessing met Eliza's. "Strange things, child. What sort of strange things?" Eliza hesitated, choosing her words with extreme care. "Numbers that don't seem to add up. Money going to places it shouldn't. Like it's being hidden." Martha put down her spatula, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked over to Eliza, her expression serious. "I've heard whispers too, Eliza. Folks talk, but whispers ain't proof. And Silas Blackwood, he ain't a man to cross lightly." "But what if it's true?" Eliza pressed, her voice gaining a little strength. "What if he's taking money that doesn't belong to him from people who trusted him?" She then, cautiously, revealed the extent of what she had copied from the ledger, showing Martha the names of the shell companies and the staggering sums involved. Martha's face grew grim as she looked at the figures. She recognized some of the investor names, families from neighboring towns, people who had worked hard for their money. Her initial skepticism began to erode, replaced by a growing anger. "The devil himself couldn't have cooked up a scheme this rotten," she muttered, shaking her head. "He's been bleeding these good folks dry." A flicker of hope ignited in Eliza's chest. Martha believed her. "I don't know what to do," Eliza confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just a girl." "He's a powerful man." Martha placed a comforting hand on Eliza's shoulder. "You ain't just a girl, child. You've got a sharp mind, sharper than most men I know. And you ain't afraid to look where others won't. That makes you dangerous. Dangerous to men like Blackwood." She paused, her gaze hardening. "We need more than just these numbers, Eliza. We need something undeniable. Something that will put Blackwood behind bars and clear Abernathy's name too. He's a decent man, caught in a terrible bind. Martha then shared her own knowledge, piecing together fragmented conversations she'd overheard, observing Abernathy's clandestine meetings and recalling instances where Silas had been overly eager to dismiss financial concerns. Together they began to formulate a plan, a dangerous, intricate scheme to gather irrefutable evidence against Silas Blackwood. Eliza, the starving girl who read numbers, had found her first unlikely ally, and together they were about to challenge the carefully constructed world of the powerful rancher. The plan, hatched between Eliza and Martha, was audacious and fraught with peril. It hinged on Abernathy, the man caught in the crossfire, and his deep-seated guilt. Martha, using her knowledge of the ranch's social dynamics, arranged for Eliza to be sent on an errand to a neighboring town, a plausible excuse that would get her out of Silas's immediate vicinity for a crucial period. While Eliza was gone, Martha would approach Abernathy, armed with the evidence Eliza had painstakingly gathered and a carefully worded plea for his cooperation. Martha found Abernathy in his usual state of quiet despair, hunched over his desk, the lamplight illuminating his weary face. She sat down opposite him, her demeanor kind but firm. "Elias," she began, her voice gentle, "I know about Silas. I know what he's been doing." Abernathy flinched, his eyes darting nervously towards the door. "Martha, I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't lie to me, Elias," Martha said, her voice unwavering. "I've seen the ledgers, and I have Eliza. She's a clever girl. She's seen them too. She's copied down everything, the shell companies, the phantom shipments, the money funneling away." Abernathy's face drained of color. He looked at Martha, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning hope. "Eliza? That young girl?" "She's more than just a young girl, Elias," Martha continued. "She's got a mind like a steel trap, and she's put it all together. She knows Silas is robbing honest folks blind, and she knows you've been forced into it." Martha then explained the plan. Eliza was out of the way for a few days. Abernathy needed to use this time to access the original, unadulterated financial records that Silas kept hidden, perhaps in his private study. These records, combined with Eliza's copies, would be the irrefutable proof they needed. Abernathy, after a long, agonizing silence, finally nodded. The weight of his complicity had become unbearable. He keeps them in a safe in his study," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Behind a painting. But he's careful. He'll know if anything is disturbed." "We'll be careful," Martha assured him. "You just get us access, and when Silas comes to you, wanting more fabricated documents, you give him this. You confront him with the truth." When Eliza returned, she found Abernathy a man transformed. The despair had been replaced by a grim determination. He had retrieved the hidden ledgers and had spent the past few days painstakingly comparing them with Eliza's copied figures. The discrepancies were not just present, they were glaring, damning. Silas had meticulously documented his fraud in a secondary set of books, the originals he intended to destroy once his scheme was complete. The following afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Silas Blackwood summoned Abernathy to his study. He was in a jovial mood, his smile wide and disarming. "Elias, my good man," he boomed, "I trust everything is in order. Just need a few final figures for the upcoming investor reports. Nothing to trouble your aging mind with, of course." Abernathy stood straighter than he had in years. He met Silas's gaze, his own eyes steady. "Silas," he began, his voice surprisingly firm, "I have the figures you requested, but they are not what you expect." Silas's smile faltered. "What do you mean, Abernathy? Are you questioning my instructions?" "I am questioning your actions, Silas," Abernathy said, placing a thick ledger on Silas's polished desk. "This is your private ledger, the one detailing the true extent of your dealings with Blackwood Holdings. And this," he added, sliding Eliza's copies across the desk, corroborates every single fraudulent entry. Silas's face contorted, his benevolent mask shattering to reveal the venomous snake beneath. He lunged for the ledgers, but Martha, who had positioned herself discreetly near the study door, stepped forward, blocking his path. In her hand, she held a heavy cast-iron skillet, its polished surface glinting menacingly. "It's over, Silas," Martha said, her voice ringing with authority. "We know everything." Silas Blackwood, trapped and exposed, stood defiant for a moment, his eyes blazing with fury. But the sheer audacity of their plan, the undeniable evidence laid bare before him, and the unwavering resolve in the eyes of the two people he had so thoroughly underestimated, broke him. The confrontation had arrived, not with a bang, but with the quiet, inexorable force of truth wielded by a starving girl and a determined cook. The air in Silas Blackwood's study crackled with a tension far thicker than any dust storm the prairie had ever known. Silas, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and rage, stood cornered, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. Abernathy, his frame now imbued with a newfound strength, stood by the desk, his hand resting protectively on the damning ledgers. Martha, her stance unwavering, held her skillet like a shield, a silent testament to her protectiveness. "This is absurd," Silas roared, his voice echoing off the opulent walls. "You two, a cook and a stray, think you can bring me down? I'll have you both run out of this territory or worse." "Worse than what you've done to those investors, Silas," Abernathy countered, his voice steady. "Worse than what you've forced me to do? This isn't just about numbers anymore. It's about right and wrong. And you, Silas, have strayed so far from the path of right, you can't even see it from here." He pointed to the ledgers. "Eliza's copies, combined with your hidden accounts, paint a very clear picture. Millions siphoned away. Lives ruined, all for your greed." Silas scoffed, a harsh, grating sound. "Greed? I built this ranch. I created opportunities for people like you, Abernathy. And you, girl, you owe me for the roof over your head, the food in your belly." Eliza stepped forward, her small frame exuding a quiet confidence that belied her years. "You gave me work, Silas, not charity. And for that work, you've been systematically stealing from those who trusted you. You preyed on their hopes, just like you tried to prey on my silence." Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of undeniable truth. "These numbers don't lie. They speak for themselves." The sound of approaching horses broke the tense silence. Sheriff Brody, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to justice, rode into the ranch yard, accompanied by two deputies. Martha, anticipating Silas's desperate attempts to flee or silence them, had dispatched a ranch hand to fetch the law shortly before Silas's summons. Silas's eyes widened in panic. He glanced frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Sheriff Brody entered the study, his gaze sweeping over the scene, the exposed ledgers, Abernathy's resolute posture, Martha's watchful presence, and the cornered rancher. "Silas Blackwood," he stated, his voice deep and resonant, "we have received a serious complaint. Mr. Abernathy here has provided us with evidence of significant financial fraud. We're here to investigate." Silas opened his mouth to protest, to bluster, but Abernathy calmly handed the sheriff the ledgers. "Sheriff," Abernathy said, his voice filled with a quiet dignity, "I have been complicit in Mr. Blackwood's fraudulent activities for years, under duress. But this," he gestured to the damning documents, "is the undeniable proof of his systematic deception. And this young woman, Eliza, without whom I never would have found the courage or the evidence, has played a crucial role in uncovering it." The sheriff, a seasoned veteran, quickly scanned the documents. His expression, initially neutral, hardened with each passing page. He looked at Silas, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "Looks like your luck has run out, Blackwood." Silas Blackwood, the powerful rancher who had built his fortune on lies, was arrested that day. The news spread like wildfire through the territory, a beacon of hope for those who had been defrauded. Abernathy, though facing his own legal consequences for his complicity, was treated with a degree of leniency for his cooperation and for his part in exposing the larger scheme. He found a measure of peace, his conscience finally freed from the heavy burden it had carried for so long. And Eliza? The starving girl who had arrived on the ranch with nothing but her wits had not only survived but had triumphed. She had faced down a powerful antagonist, uncovered a massive fraud, and brought a corrupt man to justice. Sheriff Brody, impressed by her intelligence and bravery, offered her a position assisting Abernathy, should he be able to continue his work after his legal troubles. Martha, beaming with pride, declared Eliza a heroine, a testament to the fact that courage and intellect could bloom even in the harshest of soils. The Blackwood Ranch, once a symbol of deceit, was now poised for a new beginning, a reckoning that proved even in the unforgiving West justice, however delayed, could ultimately prevail.